That's a pretty easy answer. The answer is more. We know that there's a critical window of brain maturation and development, and I don't think that's so debated. There might be some people that debate it a little bit, but in most scientific communities, adolescents are more vulnerable.
And do they sustain after effects, or is there any greater potential linkage to other issues down the road, be it ALS, Parkinson's, CTE, starting in adolescence than if you didn't sustain your first injury until you were an adult?
Easy answer, not a real fun one, but we don't know. I think that the idea is that, yes, we think that many of these either concussions or subconcussion hits, so things that you have no symptoms, just overall contact exposures, are cumulative in some people. We just don't know who those people are. We're not sure if there's some certain subgroup of adolescents or there's some certain subgroup of adults. But without question, we really don't know that answer, and that is in some ways the holy grail.
So that leads me to the question of when it comes to youth sports, and we're not going to take youth sports out of the culture. I totally understand that. And I don't know that I would even advocate for that unless it became, unless somebody could demonstrate that playing youth sports, gave you cancer or something like that. We're still not going to take it out of the culture in all realisticness. But that being said, if there were no youth sports in some fantastical universe or reality, if there were no youth sports, would you sleep better at night? Or would not, because you'd be out of business? I guess what I'm saying is, are youth sports are they a problem from this perspective?
That's a great question. And the answer is I'm maybe an oversimplifier, but it's a pretty easy answer. It's an easy answer. The answer is youth sports would be. I'd happily have youth sports eliminated if they were replaced with something else that was also got the same benefits that youth sports got. Mm-hmm. So you can't make a statement like, let's get rid of youth sports and then not have an alternative. So right. Just like any time you disagree with someone's opinion, you better have an alternative. Otherwise, if you're just disagreeing because you feel that way, I think you kind of lose your credibility in the fourth grade or fifth grade or something. So in my world, some youth sports. First of all, youth sports that are not for the youth but are for adults are a problem, without question. Not from just a head-related injury issue, but just for a variety of other injuries. And youth sports could be a problem if then there's no replacement that get people getting things out of youth sports. So right. Before organized sports, there were youth. And there were plots of playing, and there was plenty of benefits that got out of that. Sports is just a type of play, and it's organized play. And I'm a pretty big advocate for early adolescents, at least, to be having a whole bunch of unorganized play. And that is not just related to head injuries. That's related to a whole bunch of other ideas, including creativity, variety of other things. Sure. And that's a conversation that's fun to talk about. But, man, that's a tough one when you talk to other parents, because they don't like to think that they're part of the problem, but they certainly are.
You mentioned, I completely agree with what you just said, by the way, from my pure layman's perspective, but you mentioned sports or activities that were made for adults. What's an example of one of those that you meant?
Sports and activities that are made, all organized sports are made by adults. Like if you just randomly took 6-year-olds and they didn't watch TV or didn't watch sports, they wouldn't be playing tackle football. They wouldn't be playing baseball. They wouldn't be playing. So they play, ring around the rosy, tag,
sure.
Other things. So I guess when people say the word sport, I think that they routinely think of a ball sport or a organization or a sport that is not just free play. So I guess I'm just kind of using those interchangeably.
Okay. So what do the statistics say are sports where there is a higher incidence rate of brain injury or brain trauma than others?
Well, there's something that's because it's a very specific question, and there's something that we have science to kind of confirm, right? So without question, American football has one of the highest contact incident reports or incident exposures than all sports. Women's hockey is right up there. Lacrosse is right up there. Women's soccer is right up there, followed then by men's soccer. So you have a lot of those are higher incidence exposures. So time of doing something leading to how likely it is you to have a concussion or head injury or lump them all together. So we do know which ones are higher potential, but I can tell you from practicing for almost 8 years now, I've seen it in all. I mean, I've seen it from diving to cross country to the whole 9 yards. So, but yeah, there are higher related activities that have head injuries than others. And then you start throwing in more obscure things like that we don't really have good data on because they're not maybe sanctioned by Minnesota State High School League or some other national organization, where you start playing, hey, I'm just out riding my bike, or I'm downhill skiing, or I'm skateboarding at the park, or I'm, in a car accident. Like when you really compare head injuries of patients from American football, for example, to driving a car, it's not even close. I mean, so, they're more likely to get a head injury riding the carpool to the football game than they are actually at the football game. But again, it comes down to what's elective and what's not. And this gets philosophical, but people would say, well, we have to drive to work, or we have to drive this way, or we have to do this. And then you just kind of look at them like, wow, I'm so sorry you have to do all these things. But, it becomes this kind of battle of, we know what things are more likely to get a head injury. It's just about, well, what things are we willing to give up or willing to call optional in this culture? That's well said. And yeah, I mean, the sort of social aspect or sociological aspect of it is, you're right. I mean, it's a huge driver of it, but it's all, I mean, but that's a completely different discussion, right? I mean, that's sort of macro, sort of community, like cultural kind of thing. At that point, I'm just a neighbor. I'm just a parent. Just like anyone else, fully fine. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't be very powerful and very well, thought out and educated, no matter what your education level is about a topic. It's just being thoughtful. Right. So is the immediate injury, brain injury, and impact therefrom what we should be worried, and then treating that, what we should be worried about, or at what point do we need to start talking about and worrying about potential linkage to other conditions down the road, again, be it ALS, Parkinson's, CTE, what have you? Well, I hope we have that answer someday. I mean, again, I just want to make the emphasis to the listeners that concussions don't equal CTE. Like CTE is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is a devastating postmortem diagnosis that without question is getting more and more limelight. I happen to, it's amazing that I grew up in the same hometown as the main researcher, Dr. Ann McKee, who works at Harvard. She actually grew up in the same hometown as me. But she's doing amazing science. But the inability to link concussions to CTE is real. CTE is a real entity, and is becoming increasingly more common in finding out by certain families that have donated their brains. So there's a selection bias without question of the brains that they're finding these in. But the hard part of really knowing, do concussions cause CTE? That is a very difficult scientific discussion or scientific thing to prove. There's just a tremendous amount of correlation that is there that is hard to ignore, getting harder and harder to ignore, for sure. And so your question is a great one about, well, when do you start worrying about something like that? Well, when you really start worrying is when we really know it causes that. I think that there's having a concussion and feeling terrible and feeling depressed and feeling like you have a headache and feeling like you're not yourself for 2 weeks up to 3 or 4 or 5 months is an awful thing. I mean, if anyone's had the flu or felt crummy for a week, it's awful. And if you put a 15, 16-year-old feeling like crap as a sophomore or junior in high school and they're socially trying to just figure out their way. When I see my kids in concussion clinic, I'm not thinking about CTE when they're 80 or 72 or 60. I'm thinking about, man, they just are missing out on a bunch of things and prom and life. And so it's tough. I think that's a good question. I just think that, there has to be both. I think the short answer is you start thinking about it when someone's had multiple concussions. You start thinking about it when someone seems to get symptoms from minimal things, like, wow, nothing really happened to that person and they're struggling. Or they're feeling like there's a real lingering dip in their overall performance. That's when you really start to say, we got to do something, not because I think they have X, Y, or Z chronic illness, but because I just don't think the risk is outweighing the benefit for this athlete.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important point, but that correlation does not necessarily mean causation, right?
It does not. Yeah, it does not.
In everything. I mean, but in the world, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen simultaneous to other things that are not related to one another. And yes, well,
and the scariest thing about CTE is that a lot of the people that have found the CTE have really had either no or very minimal concussion diagnoses. So like the people that say, well, I'm just, when I'm going to retire at my 5th concussion, I think you're kind of holding onto a parachute that doesn't exist, which is scary and sad. There's many people that have had CTE found and had no documented concussion. So it's really about, if it is about, or if there really is causation, it might be about just contact exposures and subclinical concussive hits that at this point with our technology and the resources that we have are largely unmeasurable. So if you are playing football as a 10-year-old and you play up until you're 25 and you never have a concussion, you're not safe, in quotation marks, and you feel like you're, quote, safe because you're driving in a big truck, like you can't get hurt. I mean, right. I just think that's it's very sad, a very sad false sense of security. So the subclinical, subconcussive hits that are without question have a correlation with CTE, those are the ones that really scare me. And that's what is the biggest threat to football, for sure, specifically.
Okay, so we've been talking with Dr. Matt Hopkins. A few more minutes here. Matt is with TRIA Sports Medicine Doctor with their sports concussion program, and this has been a great discussion. And again, thank you so much for your time tonight. A couple more questions for me, and then we'll let you get back to your Sunday evening. But where would you like to see preventative measures, be it equipment or well, let's just start with equipment. Is equipment that we have today, let's just look at football, American football. Is the equipment that we have today enough?
I think that I think there is some variation. So I think that if you're playing a sport, there are certain helmets that are either less, there's certainly helmets that are more obsolete than others, and not every school district across this country has the same access to dollars. Concussions don't, however, or helmets don't prevent concussions.
Right.
And so at some level, the equipment really isn't the holy grail. I don't think it is. So I think that the money being thrown at equipment is without question good intentioned, but largely a little bit futile. So equipment in American football, prevention of concussions, I think is not that far off from where it needs to be. It'd be nicer for money to be better dispersed, and kids running around with 4-year-old helmets or 5-year-old helmets that don't fit properly or aren't really on, I think is a little bit sad. But I don't think much more to say about equipment is really going to get us a lot farther.
So equipment is not necessarily, or can't be preventative given how brains get injured. But can it lessen the impact or lessen the severity of the injury?
I don't think that's necessarily that proven either. There's been some improvements with some of the the helmets that have been out there, but again, the same physiologic or physics barriers are in play. Some people will even argue that the more protective of a helmet you have, the more dangerous it can be.